All right, so we're back with Chapter 7, talking about the economic sectors, and we're still focusing on the agrarian sector, the primary sector. And one of the big shifts in recent history is the shift of farming from just providing us food to providing us money. So, in other words, for most of human existence, farming was just to feed your family and maybe your village. But now, farming is a business of its own, and we grow crops on vast scales commercially. Not only crops that we eat, but things that we use like cotton and linen. A good example here, this is the San Joaquin Valley in California. Most of the vegetables and fruit that we eat in the United States is grown here. Huge fields that basically sell tons and tons of strawberry and lettuce and celery, for instance. And with that, the market for these foods has gone from local to global. And so when you go to the grocery store, right, you buy vegetables from around the world, you don't even think about it anymore. I mean, if you want grapes, you can pretty much go to Jewel or Aldi's or Target and you can find grapes. But think about that, right? If the grapes are grown here, they're only in season. They harvest them in the fall. So how do you get grapes in the middle of winter? How do you get celery in December, right? And that's shipped from places like Chile or Mexico. We eat bananas. I mean, every one of you who loves bananas, and I doubt there's anyone in this class who has not had a banana in the last year, right, that had to be shipped. And so we have these huge supply chains, right? Food from around the world, and it's very complex how it navigates and gets here. And with that, the amount of land that we use for farming has just expanded dramatically, and we use technology, like we talked about, the Green Revolution, to get even more food per acre. We use more technology, more chemicals. Okay? And so farmers and farmland, even though they are the base of the economy, have become integrated into the global market. Okay? Because they're not just growing food to feed their families, they're growing food to make money. And if you are a coffee farmer in Costa Rica, right, the cost of coffee around the world affects you directly. You know, banana farmers in Honduras, are affected by people who are, not buying bananas during the COVID shutdown, right? And also to use this new technology, better chemicals and better pesticides and better equipment, it takes a lot of money. And that's what capital is. So it takes more capital to access this technology. And so what happens is it tends to put the poorer farmers at a disadvantage. They don't have this ability to compete. And so what happens is if they can't compete in the global market because they can't afford the best farming technology and seeds, they fall behind. And oftentimes, if you're a farmer, your land is your value. So if you can't pay your debts, they take your land. We see land grabs, commodification of land. Land that was maybe held in common, like a pasture that was shared by the village in England in the 1700s was enclosed to make way for sheep farming. It was more profitable. And so minority peasantry around the world are the most vulnerable to this. Again, they don't have the necessarily the money to compete, right? Now, that's not to say that there is not resistance to this. The book talks about in Honduras and many other areas of the world, they have kind of banded together to form their own kind of cooperative marketing, their own kind of, they share their resources. There are several examples of coffee farmers, small individual farmers who on their own could not buy the equipment to harvest the coffee and the latest and greatest in technology. They band together and they share their harvest and they share in the profits. In a sense, they're almost kind of industrializing together. But food chains are extremely complex. Think about what you eat on any given day and think about all the different ingredients and where they come from. It used to be 100 years ago, all your food came from basically either your farm or 100 miles away. But with refrigerated supply and trains and airplanes, you can have food from around the world. And as more and more people move to the city and don't farm, well, the food has to come somewhere else. An interesting thing we see is called Bennett's Law. And this applies around the world. As people make more money, the amount of starch, which is rice, potatoes, and wheat, decreases, and the amount of meat and dairy they consume increases. The more money you make, the more meat and milk you drink. And this isn't just the United States. And so what happens is we see more and more trades of foodstuffs, right? Think about sushi, right? In the last 20, 30 years, sushi has become a very highly sought after thing in Chicago. But the fish comes from the Pacific Ocean, specifically from a fish market in Tokyo. It's all shipped here by airplane, right? Globalized foodstuff. That's not to say you don't have short food chains. If you go to farmers markets, they can be quite short. If you live, say, in rural Mexico, you probably are buying locally. You don't quite have that complexity. You might have a small market in the area. So that varies. But different consumers access different types of food. In other words, the more economic power you have, the more complex the food you can access. So with agriculture, here's an example of productivity. With technology and better seeds, in 1850, right, for 1 acre of land, you gained 40 bushels of corn, okay, or grain, so wheat. So bushel is just a measurement. So the same amount of land in 1850 to get 40 acres of wheat, it took you about 75 to 90 hours of work over the summer to cause that. I mean, the equipment you use is quite simple, a plow and a horse. 50 years later in 1900, that same amount of land gave the same amount of food, but now look, half the work, 75 hours. And you're using more and more, using a gang plow, a harrow, using more technology. 50 years later, now you're getting 50 bushels. So you're getting a little bit more, but only 10 hours of work. You're using a tractor and a picker. And today, you're now getting 100 bushels. So you're doubled what you're getting in 150 years in 2.5 hours. So you're doubling the amount of food you can grow, and you are going from 75 to 2 hours of work using tractors, herbicides, self-propelled planters. They use satellite technology and drones and computers and high-yield seeds. A lot of investment in this. But problem is there are environmental costs. As we talked about a little bit with the Green Revolution, this technology to grow better crops has some unintended side effects, genetically modified organisms, right? So we create corn that does not need as much water, or we create wheat that grows twice as fast, or doesn't need pesticides because insects won't eat it. We breed cows that make twice as much milk, or pigs that have half the fat, right? And we use technology to do this. We do DNA splicing. And there is some worry that we don't know all the effects of this. Another thing, commercial agriculture uses a lot of chemicals because one of the things that stops you from harvesting all your food is if things eat it in the field. So you put poison on it. Well, the problem is, hopefully that poison doesn't affect us. It definitely affects animals. In the 1960s, Rachel Carlson wrote a book called Silent Spring, and she noticed that every year there were less songbirds every spring. And that's because of all the pesticide that was being used was getting into not only the plants that we were growing, but getting into the groundwater. And this is poison. It kills birds. And she said if we don't be careful, we're not going to have any birds. It'll be a silent spring. We have a huge issue of all things with honeybees. Honeybees are they're dying left and right. Now, why is this a problem with honeybees? Well, if you know anything about plants, right, plants have a flower that has to be fertilized. That's how plants reproduce. There's a male part and a female part. And you have to transfer the pollen. And that's how plants fertilize each other, right? And plants can't get up and walk around. They rely on insects like honeybees, because honeybees love the nectar of the flowers, but they get the pollen on them, and they pollinize plants. So honeybees fertilize plants. Without honeybees, any plant that has a flower may not grow. No apples, for instance, or tomatoes. And so that without honeybees, we could very well see an end to a lot of flowering plants as food. You'd have to go and do it by hand. It's very expensive. In fact, we figure in 2002 that was $10 billion of damage due to lost honeybees. And another thing we see is fertilizers. So fertilizer is plant food. We give it more food, it grows. Problem is, if we give it too much food, some of that gets into the water, and it gets into the rivers. And a big issue with that is that when fertilizer gets into the river, it's plant food. And when it gets to the mouth of a river, all that plant food makes the plants in the water grow, specifically algae, right? So have you ever seen a lake or a pond that has a big thick layer of green scum? That's algae. Problem is, When the algae grow with all this extra food, they grow faster than normal, and then they die. And when they die, they sink to the bottom of the water and they rot. And the process of rotting pulls oxygen from the water. So if you're a fish, you're out of luck. That's called eutrophication. And we see this at the mouth of major rivers. The increased runoff from farm fields has far higher amounts of fertilizer than would normally be there. This algae then in the water grows so fast that it all blooms at once and then it dies. And as it rots, it pulls oxygen. So fish and crabs and animals that use oxygen in the water have to either leave or die. We call it hypoxia. Every year off the mouth of the Mississippi River, there is a huge dead zone. This one's from 2014, about 5,000 square miles. Here's an economic cost. A large amount of shrimp is caught here every year in the United States. There's no shrimp there anymore, right? So this is all part of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is when agriculture begins to use technology. And originally in the 1940s, the idea was to do this to help countries that were starving grow more food. India in the 1940s could not grow enough food to feed their people. They had to buy food from other countries as well as what they grew. But with the application of technology, they now can actually feed their people and sell food. So the Green Revolution gives better crops, more crops per acre, with better irrigation, lots of chemicals. But as the book points out, and I have to agree, you could say that it is a flawed experiment because we see a lot of environmental damage and harm not only to the environment, but to the communities of farmers that cannot participate in this due to the high intensive costs. An often unremarked upon issue is suicides among farmers in India in the 1980s skyrocketed because small, poor farmers could not keep up with the technology. They couldn't afford it. And so they were losing their land. They had no land, no way to feed their families. Everything that they were supposed to do in life, they could not do. They were going destitute and hopeless. And so the rate of suicides just skyrocketed. It became national news in India. And so that is an aspect of the Green Revolution. All right, we're going to pause right here. We'll come back with the secondary sector of manufacturing in just a little bit.